Some people move through the digital world in complete silence. They watch, they read, they notice everything, yet they rarely post a single thing. Maybe this already sounds familiar. In a place built on constant visibility, their absence creates a quiet tension. Not because they're hiding, but because something about being visible feels heavier than most people realize. And that weight shapes a pattern that rarely gets named. In many situations, someone who doesn't post isn't avoiding connection at all. They're avoiding the internal noise that appears when their life becomes public. Maybe this is the moment where something clicks. Posting isn't a neutral action for them. It comes with a set of mental steps, small evaluations, subtle predictions, quiet doubts about how their words or images might be interpreted. None of this is dramatic. It's simply the way their mind organizes experience. For these individuals, sharing something online disrupts the natural pace of how they process life. It demands immediacy, performance, and a kind of exposure that doesn't match their internal structure. They want accuracy, not attention. They want coherence, not visibility. And in a digital space where everything becomes material for comparison, they often prefer to keep what matters in its original, private form. This creates a behavioral pattern that looks like silence from the outside. But on the inside, it's something far more organized, a deliberate decision to protect their own pace. Some people don't move quickly when it comes to showing themselves online. Before they even consider posting, an internal sequence starts on its own. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just a quiet chain of evaluations that takes place beneath the surface. Maybe this sounds familiar. A single thought, "Should I share this?" opens a whole set of calculations the outside world never sees. For someone with this structure, posting isn't simply expressing something. It's anticipating how that expression might be received. Their attention automatically scans for gaps, ambiguities, or details that could lead to misinterpretation. They consider how different people might read the same sentence, how tone might shift depending on context, how timing might influence perception. What looks instantaneous for others becomes a small internal project for them. Some people pause when they notice this pattern. Even harmless posts trigger quiet predictions. Who might misunderstand? Who might overanalyze? Who might ignore it completely? None of these outcomes are catastrophic. They're just part of how their mind stays ahead of possible distortion. It's a habit formed long before social media existed, an instinct to pre-edit reality before releasing it to anyone else. This creates an unusual dynamic. The more they think, the heavier the act of posting becomes. Not because they fear judgment, but because the mental load feels disproportionate to the value of the post itself. The mind asks, "Is this worth the effort?" And most of the time, the answer is no. Silence, then, is not avoidance. It's efficiency. It's the simplest way to bypass a cognitive process that takes far more energy than the moment deserves. Instead of constantly negotiating between accuracy and exposure, they choose not to initiate the sequence at all. By holding back, they protect a sense of order in their own thinking. They reduce noise. They maintain control over what enters the public space. And for someone whose mind operates through careful prediction, this control isn't optional, it's grounding. That's the internal architecture beneath the silence. In many situations, the decision not to post comes from a careful management of visibility. Certain people don't like placing themselves in spaces where context disappears. Once something enters the public timeline, it's no longer guided by intention alone. It becomes open to assumptions, shortcuts, and projections. Maybe this already feels familiar. For some minds, that openness isn't freeing, it's disruptive. People who move through the world with strong internal filters learned early that exposure invites interpretation. Even neutral moments can be taken out of shape once other people start adding their own meaning. A simple sentence might be read as confidence by one person and indifference by another. A casual photo might be interpreted as a performance, even when it wasn't one. None of this is dramatic. It's simply the natural consequence of being seen in a space where attention is fast and context is thin. Because of that, posting feels like handing over a moment without knowing what it will turn into. These individuals prefer situations where their presence can be adjusted in real time. Tone, pace, expression, and silence included. Social media removes those tools. Everything becomes flattened into a single frame that can't be handled once it's released. Some people pause when they hear this. They realize that silence is not a retreat from others, but a boundary that keeps their inner world from being distorted. Not posting becomes a way to prevent outside narratives from shaping who they are or what their experience means. If any part of this feels familiar, naming the exact detail that resonates can be grounding. It often shows how common this quiet pattern actually is. This social filter is not about secrecy. It's about precision. It's the desire to choose when, how, and to whom parts of themselves are shown. For someone who values clarity over reach, this choice feels natural. They don't need to be seen everywhere. They need to be seen accurately. Silence then becomes less about absence and more about maintaining the shape of their identity in a space where interpretation rarely stays still. There's a quiet habit that appears in people who rarely post. Before any reaction forms on the outside, an internal check happens first. They monitor their tone, their emotional state, and the meaning behind what they want to say. This monitoring isn't a performance or a strategy. It's simply how their mind stays organized. For someone who operates like this, expression is a delayed process. They notice small shifts in themselves, subtle irritations, careful hesitations, the need to adjust a thought before it becomes language. The online environment doesn't make room for that pacing. It rewards immediacy, quick responses, and constant presence. Their internal rhythm moves differently. You might recognize something here. These individuals often think through what they feel before the feeling fully settles. They revise the sentence long before it's spoken. They correct the tone before anyone hears it. And when the digital space asks for instant clarity, their system slows down instead of speeding up. Posting feels premature, like expressing something still incomplete. This is usually the moment when many people step back from visibility. Self-monitoring doesn't stop at emotions. It extends to how they imagine others will interpret their words. They anticipate confusion. They anticipate misalignment. They anticipate the small mismatch between intention and perception. Not because they're anxious, but because the mind tries to avoid unnecessary friction. If you notice yourself in this pattern, naming the moment that stands out, whether it's the delay, the correction, or the anticipation, often reveals how your internal pace differs from the digital one. For someone shaped by this habit, silence is stable. It removes the pressure to be instantly coherent. It removes the expectation to be on at all times. And it preserves a slower, more deliberate way of understanding their own experience. They don't avoid posting because they have nothing to say. They avoid it because their internal process doesn't match the speed of the environment. And rather than forcing a pace that feels unnatural, they choose a rhythm that keeps their mind steady. For someone who grew up with this internal structure, emotions rarely settle in real time. They don't immediately know what an experience means, and they don't rush to define it. Their understanding comes after the moment has passed, once the environment is quiet and the pressure to respond is gone. Maybe this sounds familiar. It's a slower rhythm, not a weaker one. Posting interrupts that rhythm. The digital world expects instant clarity, an immediate caption, an immediate interpretation, an immediate feeling made public. But these individuals don't function that way. They need the space to let an experience breathe before putting it into words. If the meaning isn't stable yet, expressing it feels inaccurate. It feels out of sync with their inner pace. Some people pause when they recognize this. They realize their emotional process unfolds in layers. First comes the observation, then a quiet reaction. Only later does the full shape of the feeling appear. Trying to post something before that structure is complete feels premature, like labeling a thought that hasn't fully formed. Nothing about this is dramatic. It's simply the way their mind organizes emotional information. This delayed pacing also makes public visibility feel heavier. If they share something before their internal meaning is ready, they risk having it defined by others. A comment, a misread tone, a simple misunderstanding can push the emotion in a direction that wasn't theirs to begin with. And once that shift happens, it's difficult to pull the experience back into its original shape. So they stay quiet, not to hide, not to detach, but to protect the natural timing of their own emotional clarity. Silence becomes a way of keeping an experience honest, untouched by outside interpretation before it has finished forming on the inside. In the end, they aren't avoiding expression, they're avoiding distortion. They wait for the moment when the emotion feels stable enough to hold its own meaning. Only then does sharing feel possible. And most of the time, by the time that clarity arrives, the urge to post has already disappeared. In this kind of internal pattern, awareness comes with a quiet consequence. Some people recognize very quickly how sharing something changes it. A moment that felt personal becomes public material. An experience that was solid becomes open to angles they never intended. This shift isn't dramatic, but it's noticeable for minds that pay close attention to subtle changes. These individuals understand that once a post exists, it invites interpretation that doesn't stop. A familiar person might read it one way, a stranger another, and someone else might project an entirely different meaning onto it. The moment stretches beyond its original context. Maybe this sounds familiar. For someone who values accuracy, that expansion feels like losing control of what the moment was supposed to be. Some people pause when they realize how quickly a simple post can reshape the memory attached to it. An image meant to capture something small becomes commentary material. A neutral thought becomes a topic for debate. A quiet experience becomes something others evaluate. None of this is about sensitivity. It's about noticing the structural shift between a private moment and a public one. Because of this, posting feels costly. Not emotionally, cognitively. It requires accepting that the moment is no longer theirs alone. And for someone who thinks deeply before showing anything, that trade-off rarely feels useful. Silence becomes a way of keeping certain experiences intact. They don't need those experiences to be approved, reacted to, or expanded by others. They just want them to stay aligned with what they originally meant. This is usually when the decision not to post becomes consistent, It's not a statement or a stance. It's simply a recognition that shared experiences tend to change form. And someone who is highly aware of those shifts prefers to let their life unfold without adding new layers that don't belong to them. In the end, their silence is not resistance, it's preservation. It's the simplest way to keep their inner world from being rewritten by external interpretation. Some people move through the online world with a structure that doesn't match its pace. Their silence isn't a reaction to others. It's the result of the way their mind organizes effort, meaning, and exposure. Throughout their daily life, cognitive load shapes what they choose to show. The social filter adds another layer, limiting how much of their identity they allow to be interpreted by people who don't know their context. And self-monitoring keeps their expression slow, cautious, and internally consistent. Their emotional process follows its own timeline. They understand what a moment means only after it settles, and by the time that clarity arrives, the urge to share it has usually passed. Insight also plays a quiet role. They notice the shift that happens when something private becomes public, and they prefer to avoid that shift altogether. For them, experiences lose precision once they're exposed to external interpretation. Taken together, these patterns form a way of moving that looks silent from the outside. But on the inside, it's steady and coherent. Their absence from the feed isn't a lack of expression. It's a choice that preserves their natural pace, protects their meaning, and keeps their life from being shaped by reactions that don't belong to them. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden, just a structure that makes sense for the way their mind works.